Shall I continue? The good news, she's now professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati, and there she's also the director of the Center for Public Engagement with Science. And actually, speaking of institutional roles, I do want to mention how hard she worked last year to make possible a very challenging delayed meeting of the Forces of Science Association. And she's actually she's edited the proceedings in 2 volumes. The second one coming out very soon. Besides numerous papers, she's the author of the book Idealization and the Aims of Science of 2007, and the co-author of Recipes for Science of the following. Now, her research has focused on the success of science and ideas that we often associate with Nancy Cartwright, John Dutton, Michael Lynch, Catherine Elgin, especially on Bill Lincoln. She's been able to engage them more critically and push them much further. For example, in Idealization, she explains and defends how and why we should relativize in both theory and practice the pursuit of the ends of science to the capabilities and interests of both producers and users. And to some extent, I think this talk comes out of that project. And the title of the talk is Truth and Reality, How to Be a Scientific Realist Without Believing Scientific Theories Should Be True. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both departments for having me and to all of you for showing up, and Zoom attendees, that includes you as well. And then Jordy, thank you for what I think is probably the most generous introduction anyone's ever given me. That it made me feel kind of fancy for a minute. Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with a little bit of context for this project. I've argued, as Jordy gave you a sense for already, that truth isn't the right epistemic success condition for scientific explanations. This view is sometimes called non-factivism. Some people who think this is wrong, who disagree with this sort of non-factivism about explanation, want to use a commitment to realism to support their point of view, to say that we have to abandon scientific realism if we accept that move. And so that would be, if you have realist tendencies, that would be a significant challenge. So this talk and the related paper is my attempt to work through what scientific realism might look like for a non-factivist or someone who rejects veritism about explanation and understanding, and to motivate then that variety of realism, a little bit at least, in contrast to other ways in which we might want to be scientific realists. The paper that's related to this talk is forthcoming in a collection on scientific understanding and representation. And so one note in that context is that my paper is actually part of an exchange with Chris Pincock. And so the exchange also includes a paper by Chris criticizing, pretty more generally, not focused on this paper of mine, but criticizing whether a non-factivism like mine can support realism. And then we each have responses to each other's papers. So this is an attempt to actually, do a good job of really kind of getting at a philosophical point of disagreement instead of just talking in each other's general vicinities, as it seems like often happens. I don't know how well we do, but anyway, that's a bit of philosophical context for the project. So part of what I was trying to do here is say a bunch of things that I actually think are true that I know Chris Pincock thinks are wrong, which is fun. Okay, sorry. Okay, so scientific realism is a thesis about the success of science. Most traditionally, that science has been so successful at prediction and at guiding action because its theories are true, or approximately true, or ever increasing in their degree of truth, etc. So here, for example, is Anjan Chakravarty in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on realism. He says, scientific realism is a positive epistemic attitude toward the content of our best theories and models, recommending belief in both observable and unobservable aspects of the world described by the sciences. Most people define scientific realism in terms of the truth or approximate truth of scientific theories or certain aspects of theories. So if science is in the business of doing its best to generate true theories, then it seems unproblematic to think that we should turn to those theories for explanatory knowledge, for predictions, for guidance of our actions and decisions, that sort of we can have kind of one-stop shopping for products of science. If we start to move away from that idea, then things just start to look more complex. Okay, so this question of whether we should actually define positive epistemic attitude as truth or approximate truth or increasing truth is at the heart of what I want to call into question in this talk. At least at first glance, views that are popular in contemporary philosophy of science seem to create pretty basic challenges for this traditional form of scientific realism couched in terms of truth. So I'm speaking really broadly, right? Just kind of pointing to philosophical work done somewhere else in philosophy of science and how it at least seems on the face of it has relevance here as well. First of all, the embrace of model-based science introduces questions about whether theories are even the main epistemic currency in science. Models, it seems, are not definitive like theories may be. It's common to employ a variety of models for the very same phenomenon. So this starts to sort of press against the sort of one-stop shop version of scientific accounts that quickly motivated a second ago. Also, there's a common occurrence of trade-offs, as is a familiar point as well, among modeling priorities. And this calls into question whether the same vehicles can even deliver explanations, predictions, and policy guidance, right? Do we actually need to develop different kinds of models to do different jobs for us in science? And then at that point, which one is in the position, which of those models seems to be most like the theory of the phenomena that we model multiply with different aims? And then third, the widespread importance of idealization is taken by some at least to cast doubt on the idea that the best scientific theories are true, approximately true, or increasing in degree of truth over time at all, right? So whether we're talking about models or theories, if you're as impressed by the significance of idealization in science as I and some others are, then it seems like that at least puts pressure on this idea that increasing truth is what is at stake. Okay, so the most basic formulation of scientific realism as the claim that science has been and will continue to be epistemically successful is, I think, deeply appealing. So I find those intuitions compelling. So in this talk, as I mentioned already, I'll use the challenges of modeling and especially of widespread idealization to motivate the view that scientific realism should actually be fully divorced from the idea that science is in the business of generating true theories. In particular, I'm going to do three things, or we'll try to do three things. First, I'll say the challenges to traditional realism as I understand them, trying to base this in views not idiosyncratic to me, but broadly endorsed in our field, right? So that even if you think I'm wrong on a bunch of stuff, lots of smarter people have said things about science that should worry us nonetheless. After that, I'll motivate the possibility of a realism that is consistent with a rejection of the idea that science is in pursuit of truth. So again, this is aiming for carving out, at least at first, a general place in philosophical space, right, where we might turn for some view like that, even if we differ in the details. But then I will say a bit more here at this point in the talk about the version of this view that I have advocated. Finally, I will address why I think this, the view that I'll try to, the version of scientific realism I'll try to start to develop in this talk deserves to be called scientific realism at all. And I'll gesture towards what I think may actually be some advantages of this way of going about being a realist. Realism without a strict commitment to truth, I think, I'll suggest anyway, better accommodates the nature of our present day scientific achievements, and it also opens up an interpretation of cumulative scientific progress that might be able to resist the anti-realist pessimism, right? The pessimistic meta-induction that we're familiar with. So I said this quickly before, but I also want to stress that my aim in this talk is not to convince anyone to be a realist, right? You will not, if you are not inclined to scientific realism, you won't come out of this saying, aha, now I see why we should be realists. Or even really to convince you to worry about the issue of scientific realism. The aim is just to show how the rejection of veritism, I care very much about this issue, how that can be consistent with scientific realism. So if, like me, you're sort of inclined towards the scientific realism, that doesn't have to interfere with you rejecting veritism about scientific accounts. So that's kind of more where my flag is planted in this discussion. And then beyond that, as I said, I want to use this as a way to try to sort of suggest some ways, as an outsider to realism discussions, really, to kind of suggest some ways where we might kind of shift emphasis in those discussions in ways that might be kind of interesting. Okay, so first of all, why we might see views endorsed in our field as challenging the idea bound up with traditional realism that science aims for truth. Several features of scientific modeling seem, at least on the face of things, to push against the idea that scientific findings should be judged by the measure of truth. And this covers in a bit more depth what I started at the outset of the talk to use to try to motivate the whole project of what I'm up to. First of all, scientific models have reduced commitments compared to theories. And so I just have very brief, lazy references here to folks, philosophers who have said things along these lines. There's more of an air of convenience and choice of modeling approach than in theory selection. And this relates also, I think, to the common practice of employing multiple different models to account for the same phenomenon. Second, and related to employing multiple models, there are often or always, as I mentioned, trade-offs among the advantages of different modeling approaches. In other words, model design will need to prioritize either accuracy, or greater generality, for example. That's one that's gotten a lot of attention. And as Richard Levins and others have emphasized, generality is often actually taken to be the more desirable of these two goals, right? So we regularly see the sacrifice of increased accuracy to generate an account or a model that is more generally applicable. The significance of this in the present context is that compromises in truth or accuracy are at least sometimes made to further other scientific goals. And then third, as Elisa Bakulich and others have emphasized, model-based explanations proceed with substantial assistance from idealizations, or even as Bakulich puts it, fictions, introducing the possibility that false posits contribute to at least one variety of successful scientific explanations. So for these reasons, insofar as model-based science is an important form of science, it seems we philosophers are increasingly accepting of this idea. It seems that truth, approximate truth, or increasing truth no matter what, may not always be the best descriptions of the accomplishments or even the aims of this kind of science. In the rest of this initial discussion, I'm going to shift focus slightly from the significance it seems that philosophical investigations of scientific models has for the question of realism. I'm going to focus in particular on the role of idealizations and expand that discussion beyond a focus particularly on model-based science. So by idealizations, I mean assumptions made without regard for whether they're true, and often in full knowledge that they're false. So examples, easy, quick examples of idealizations: the assumption that some gas is ideal or perfect, the assumption that of a population of organisms that like begets like, and the assumption in a variety of different economic contexts that humans are perfectly rational agents. 3 quick examples of assumptions made not because they're supposed to be accurate descriptions of what actually is going on, but because it's convenient for some other reason. Idealizations are widely recognized to contribute to scientific understanding. This is by philosophers. Many of our most heralded scientific explanations involve idealizations. And this goes beyond model-based explanations that Elisa Bakulich, for example, primarily focuses on, and includes also, I think, theory and law-based explanations. So consider, for example, Nancy Cartwright's decades earlier observations about the laws of physics. So from the broadly recognized role of idealizations in scientific explanations, some philosophers, and I include myself among them, have drawn the conclusion that explanations need not be true, that the understanding explanations produce is non-factive, as I put it at the beginning of the talk. These philosophers thus reject veritism about scientific explanation. Now, of course, no one claims that scientists are indifferent to the truth value of their accounts or prefer being false over being true. The claims that those of us who reject veritism make are subtler than that, such as the idea that idealizations contribute directly to the epistemic success of our scientific explanations, and that less accurate explanations are sometimes at least better, epistemically better, than more accurate alternatives. Okay, so I'm going to pause a bit in the sort of general trajectory of this talk to talk a bit more about why I say that I reject Veritism. So here's why. Put in terms of successful scientific explanations, these are, I think, the grounds that I see for rejecting Veritism. First of all, an explanation, I get kind of all variable letter heavy in this formulation. It's a very abstract formulation. But I take it that an explanation why can explain the target phenomenon without being entirely true of it. So first point is that our successful explanations need not be entirely true. Second point, an explanation why can better explain. So now we're talking about comparative explanatory value of two different explanations. An explanation Y can better explain the target phenomenon than does an explanation Z that is actually more accurate. So sometimes I think less accurate accounts are better explanations. And then third, this is where idealizations are particularly relevant. A posit P, we're talking about a particular posit now, in some explanation Y, I think can be crucial for Y explaining X, crucial for the explanation Y's explanatory value, without being even remotely true, right? In fact, its radical falseness is essential to its value to the explanation. Okay, so I'm gonna give you really brief, I know, like I said, it's all in variable letters. I'm gonna give you really brief illustrations of each idea using the tried and true / toy example of the ideal gas law. So first of all, looking at the first point here, an application of the ideal gas law can explain the approximate behavior of a real gas with molecules that do exhibit attractive and repulsive interactions, right? Unlike as posited by the ideal gas law, despite the real gas's properties deviating from the ideal gas law's predictions, right? So you can get an explanation of approximate behavior even when you get real behavior that deviates somewhat from what is posited in the explanation. Second, in many circumstances, the ideal gas law explanation is preferable to a more accurate explanation with the van der Waals equation specifying the attractive and repulsive interactions. So this isn't universally the case, but in many cases, I think the ideal gas law explanation is going to be explanatorily better. This, in the background of this is that sort of value of generality that I mentioned in passing earlier in the context of talking about trade-offs. And then third, the posit, the idealization that a gas is ideal, that is, that a gas is composed of non-interacting point particles, is crucial for an ideal gas law explanation, but may nonetheless deviate significantly from the properties of the real gas. We can still have, I think, a highly successful, desirable explanation of the approximate behavior of a real gas in a variety of circumstances, even with this posit that's not even remotely true of a gas under study. So note that I take it here that disagreement about Veritism probably doesn't hinge on whether there are examples with the features I've listed, I think, as I read the debate anyway, but rather whether these are sufficient reasons to reject Veritism. So I'm guessing that the folks who accept a strong role for idealization and explanation, but think we need to remain Veritas, will sort of mostly go along with me on these points, but then argue that that's not sufficient grounds for rejecting Veritas, I think. Okay, so other philosophers, the ones I just mentioned, accept the idea that idealizations contribute positively to scientific explanation, but they've developed accounts that seek to retain Veritism about explanation. For example, work by Insa Lawler, Emily Sullivan, and Kareem Khalifa, and then Chris Pincock as well, do something along those lines. One motivation for developing a Veritism about explanation that accommodates idealization is the thought that this will enable scientific realism to be retained. So, nonetheless, in this talk, at least for the sake of argument, I'd like you to take seriously the view that these features of idealization warrant reconsidering whether or to what extent truth is a requirement or even an aim for our scientific accounts. So let's say I tried to sort of motivate the idea that we might want to reject Veritism about our scientific explanations. Let's say you're not fully on board. Take it as an assumption for the rest of our conversation then. Let's just sort of follow that path and see where I can get for scientific realism from there. There may actually be a way to rehabilitate a central rule for truth. I certainly haven't given you anything decisive here, right? But on the face of it, the important role for idealizations, false assumptions, in our scientific accounts of the world as well as the features of model-based science discussed earlier, do seem to support, I think, looking for a scientific realism that does not require a commitment to truth, approximate truth, or increasing truth of our scientific accounts. At the very least, such a realism can remain non-committal on these questions of the extent to which truth is a benchmark for epistemic success, thus sidestepping the complications of modeling and idealization that have received significant attention of late in philosophy of science. So even if I'm not right, even if the folks who are similarly impressed by idealization but want to be veritous about explanation are right, it's kind of convenient if we can deploy scientific realism where the details of how that debate turn out are not crucial to the ability to be scientific realists, if you are so inclined. Okay, so far I've used scientific modeling and idealizations to motivate the idea that it might be beneficial to develop a form of scientific realism that doesn't require strict truth, increasing truth, or potentially even the pursuit of true scientific theories. Now I want to outline the form that such a realism might take. Here too, like I said, I'm going to aim for carving out a general place in philosophical space and then to develop a specific version of the view that I would like to advocate, influenced especially by the use of idealizations in sciences, as I briefly discussed before. Now, the first task is just to take a step back, right, from that definition of epistemic success as truth, as Andron indicates most scientific realisms do. In particular, we need to find a more generic formulation of realism that doesn't already presume a commitment to truth. So here's Chakravarty again, a bit later in the SEP entry that I drew from earlier. He says, what all of these approaches, he's talking about approaches to defining realism in terms of epistemic achievement, have in common is a commitment to the idea that our best theories have a certain epistemic status. They yield knowledge of aspects of the world, including unobservable aspects. So in this formulation, that realism is at its most basic, the idea that our scientific accounts, which is my generic term, right, for theories, models, and all the rest, qualify as epistemic achievements and yield knowledge of the world. This seems to capture a commitment to realism at its most basic, and it also creates room to maneuver. If there is a natural way to interpret scientific accounts as epistemic achievements that yield knowledge, despite their sacrifices of truth, despite any sacrifices of truth, right? I'm going to be more generic and not require you to reject veritism, then that will enable a form of realism to be preserved regardless of whether the veritists or those who reject veritism are right. So in what way, if any, do our scientific accounts yield knowledge bearing on observable and unobservable entities despite potential sacrifices of truth? On this initial question, insight can be gained from a convergence of views among recent accounts of idealization and explanation. Elisa Bakulich, who I've already mentioned, a 2014 paper by Bob Batterman and Colin Rice, and I, among others, emphasized patterns. So here's Bakulich. She says, the model explains the explanandum by showing how elements of the model correctly capture the pattern of counterfactual dependence of the target system. And then my take in my 2017 idealization book, scientific knowledge consists of truths about causal patterns. Grasping those truths about causal patterns comprises understanding of the phenomena embodying the patterns. Truths of causal patterns are by and large partial untruths about phenomena, accomplished with the use of idealizations. Catherine Elgin, who Jordi also mentioned in his introduction, focuses less explicitly on patterns, but her emphasis on the aim of exemplification, I think this suggests implicit reliance on pattern or similar concepts as well. That is instantiation of a property or relation across some range of circumstances. This philosophical convergence suggests a potential way forward, I think. Such patterns might be the objects of our scientific knowledge. So let's call this causal pattern realism. Okay, sorry. Got confused from where I am in the talk. I thought I would have said something else before this. Causal pattern realism would be a form of selective realism, perhaps akin to a kind of structural realism. Realism about the relations depicted in our scientific accounts, not taken as descriptions of the targets of investigation directly, but of the patterns those targets of investigations embody. I'm going to back up because I feel like, no, okay, I just got confused about the order in which I have stuff. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that's the sort of quick big picture direction that I want to head. The key move here is allowing non-identity between target of investigation and object of knowledge. You may study and learn about one thing, while the object of knowledge is technically something else. So that's the key move in what I just said about what a causal pattern realism would look like. So that key move, positing this non-identity, creates two issues that you would need to address if you wanted to be a scientific realist like this. The first issue regards the difference between the target of investigation and the object of knowledge. So if the latter, if the object of knowledge is not the same as the former, as the target of investigation, then what is it? Is the object of knowledge structure, patterns, or something else, right? So there's an easy answer to what the object of knowledge is when it's what we're studying. If we're saying it's something else, then you've created a question of what it actually is and how it's different from what's under investigation. Implicit in this question is the need to justify why this, whatever we settle on, should be taken to be the intended object of scientific knowledge. So then the second issue that needs to be addressed regards the connection between the target of investigation and the object of knowledge. If we accept that this is not a relation of identity, again, there's an easy answer. If what we learn about, what we gain knowledge about just is what we're studying, if I start to draw a distinction between those, then what connects them? What makes this knowledge qualify as an epistemic achievement, ultimately about the target of investigation? There must be some special relationship, if it's not identity, some other special relationship for this to be the case. All right, so those are these kind of big issues that come into relief if you make this move of saying what we're actually gaining knowledge of in scientific investigations is not the phenomena targeted by those investigations. So here are my suggestions for addressing these two issues. And here I do start to move into sort of specifics of my account. I've already suggested on the basis of some recent views about the explanatory value of idealizations that the object of scientific knowledge might be causal patterns, what Bakulich has called patterns and counterfactual dependence. And in my view, at least by and large, these regard the manipulability relations that constitute causal dependence, following James Woodward in how we think about causation. Postulating causal patterns rather than causal relationships or causal processes as the object of scientific knowledge reflects the scientific practice of strategically focusing on some difference makers to identify the scope of dependence, that is the scope of what Woodward calls the invariance of a causal relationship. So this is what we get by focusing on causal patterns or positing causal patterns as the object of knowledge. There's the pattern bit there as well. A strategic focus on certain difference makers and a neglect of others. Beyond according with the insights of several recent accounts of idealization, this also captures well science's frequent focus on general laws, patterns, and tendencies. Many causal patterns, like the pattern depicted by the ideal gas law, are broad regularities that are limited in scope and can have exceptions. Sometimes scientists are instead interested in accounting for the interplay of multiple causes, which motivates a focus on a more specific causal pattern with a narrower scope, that is, a causal pattern that's present in a smaller set of phenomena. The van der Waals equation, with additional parameters specifying molecular size and attraction when those parameters are specified, depicts a more specific pattern with a narrower scope than does the ideal gas law. As this illustrates, any target of investigation, such as the behavior of some real gas, embodies multiple, perhaps countless causal patterns. The strategic isolation of one set of causal factors gives rise to a focus on just one causal pattern among many that are embodied in the target of investigation. Just as it is a matter of choice which phenomena are targeted in scientific investigation, it's also a matter of choice which causal pattern is targeted in the investigation of a given phenomenon. This many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena is, in my view, of central importance. This is actually, I think, something that ends up making my view, or at least emphasis of this, ends up making my view a little bit different from some of the other anti-veritas who I mentioned before. Insofar as our scientific knowledge regards causal patterns, the resulting knowledge is inevitably an incomplete perspective on the target of investigation. And when idealizations facilitate the knowledge, perspective that is enabled by false posits of features of the target that are really important to the phenomenon, but that are incidental just to the causal pattern that is focal. Causal pattern realism thus introduces a variability in our scientific knowledge that goes beyond what phenomena are, that goes beyond which phenomena our investigations target. The nature of our scientific knowledge is on this view relational to the sets of causes deemed interesting by investigations or investigators or their audience. For that reason, this might be considered a form of perspectival realism. The view is in some respects similar to Michela Massini's perspectival realism, as developed in her new book that's just out, that I'm partway through now, particularly her emphasis on realism regarding robust phenomena. But on the other hand, from my view, the status of qualifying as knowledge isn't indexed to research context, right? This just is knowledge, full stop. And the latter is often thought, at least, to be entailed by perspectival realism. So on my approach, the role for perspective isn't, right, that something only qualifies as knowledge from a given perspective. It's just in what knowledge is prioritized. That is, knowledge of which causal patterns is actually generated. So what I have in mind for the difference between the objects of scientific knowledge and the targets of investigation is that of causal patterns versus the phenomena embodying those and other causal patterns. The key difference this approach has for the relationship between truth and knowledge is that idealizations, like the posit that a gas is ideal, can contribute directly to knowledge of a causal pattern, even as they introduce falsehoods, clear falsehoods of the phenomena. So why create this gap, what I've called the difference? First, causal pattern realism responds to the considerations that I raised in the first part of this talk, accommodating scientific practices that seem to be driven by considerations other than maximizing the truth of our scientific accounts. I should say the truth of our scientific accounts about the phenomena they target. Second, an advantage of this approach to realism is that it's consistent with how science has developed many different accounts of the very same phenomena. And third, I'll offer a promissory note. In the last part of the talk, I will at least briefly suggest some further philosophical advantages to embracing this kind of approach to realism. Okay, so first, now that we have my view at least of the difference, what it is that's investigated versus what it is that is our object of scientific knowledge, I need to answer the question, what's the condition, what's the connection? So I've separated these two things from each other. How are they specially related, such that our scientific knowledge is somehow knowledge of or gives insight into phenomena? Why take knowledge of causal patterns to constitute an epistemic achievement about phenomena? The brief answer is just that when a causal pattern is embodied in a phenomenon, knowledge of the causal pattern, I think, can explain the phenomenon. Right? So we explain phenomena with reference to the scientific knowledge that science is generating about the causal patterns that they embody. Given the many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena, I emphasized on the last slide, there's more that has to be said about the conditions in which knowledge of the former, knowledge of causal patterns, suffices to explain the latter, the target phenomena. Here on this slide, I'm going to sketch those conditions, but the approach requires moves that I'm not going to be able to make fully precise or adequately defend in this talk. This is more fully developed in a different philosophical context in my idealization book that I mentioned from 2017. First off, and I'm going to try not to get bogged down. First off, let's presume that a given scientific account qualifies as knowledge of some causal pattern, since what's at issue for right now is how that knowledge in turn relates to the target of investigation, such that it constitutes an epistemic achievement about the target. So in my view, to explain the target of investigation, such an account must relate both to the target phenomenon, how that phenomenon is characterized in the explanandum, and then also to the audience in the proper ways. So summarizing those relationships from my perspective. First, the pattern has to be embodied by the target phenomenon. This entails that the causal claims made in the depiction of the causal pattern, I guess that's the way to say that, are approximately true. Importantly, they need not be a comprehensive account of the phenomenon, but merely depict the influence of at least one causal factor. Even the same causal factors may be depicted differently in characterizations of distinct causal patterns, but the claims themselves, right? So not the idealizations, the sort of facilitative posits, but the claims made in the depiction of the causal pattern still need to be approximately true to court, right? Not merely within a specific research context. Second, the causal pattern must account for the explanation. That is, the features of the target phenomenon specified in the call for explanation. So roughly put, this means that what the depiction of the causal pattern, including any idealizations, would entail is specified by the approximately true explanandum as having occurred. Any given causal pattern embodied in the phenomenon can only explain features conforming to that pattern, not unrelated features of the phenomenon or deviations from the pattern, right? There's a limitation in the explanatory scope based on the focus on just one causal pattern among many. Third and finally, I promised connection to the audience, the depicted causal pattern must address the cognitive needs of those seeking explanation. Given the many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena, and the inevitable relationality of depicting one causal pattern rather than a different causal pattern, there's an ambiguity to which causal pattern is explanatory that needs to be resolved with reference to the agenda, the concerns of those who are seeking explanation. This is influenced by their interests and their background knowledge, as well as by incidental circumstances, potential biases, and blind spots, sort of anything fair game. Specifying the explanandum, I've argued elsewhere, can't resolve the ambiguity. We have no choice but just to return to the concerns and questions that motivate those seeking explanation. Okay, our simple ideal gas law example can show what these requirements amount to. The ideal gas law succeeds as an explanation of the pressure in a balloon doubling when the volume was halved. This is the explanandum. When, first of all, looking at my 3 bullet points again, right? The depicted relationship between pressure and volume is roughly true. This application of the ideal gas law entails the pressure roughly doubling, our explanandum. And then third, the ideal gas law application addresses the explanation seeker's cognitive needs. This third condition would be the case, for example, for someone with a rough understanding of the relevant physics, but who's forgotten the exact relationship between pressure and volume, or what other variables like temperature the relationship depends on. This wouldn't be the case for someone who remembers the ideal gas law really well. They paid attention in physics class and how it applies here. But they thought that temperature had also increased in the system to an extent that the balloon's pressure would have caused it to pop. That requires a different causal pattern featuring different causal influences to explain. And when I sort of motivated that idea really quickly, all that I changed is background knowledge, right? Nothing has changed about our explanandum of the system. Okay, a background assumption here is that all scientific explanations are relative to the audience's cognitive needs in this way. The shared background knowledge of a scientific community may constrain the variety of causal patterns that are explanatory, but variability will persist due to which specific questions are posed, which other phenomena are of interest, which methods are employed, and so on. So this briefly is what I take to be necessary for knowledge of a causal pattern to constitute an epistemic achievement in the form of explanation of the target of investigation. The best explanation of a given explanandum features a causal pattern embodied by the phenomenon, accounting for the explanandum that best addresses the audience's cognitive needs. If increased accuracy of the phenomenon contributes to this, it does so because it's contributing to this, not just because it's more accurate, right, in some additional condition. So much more is needed, of course, to motivate this as the right way to think about scientific explanation. I can't do that in this talk. Here, I'm simply sketching a view with the potential to connect target of investigation to the object of scientific knowledge as I've defined to flesh out what causal pattern realism actually amounts to. This view creates the desired space between objects of scientific knowledge and targets of investigation, while maintaining the requisite connection. The former, the objects of scientific knowledge, causal patterns, are multiple, while the latter, empirical reality, is single. Knowledge of the former inevitably, no matter what, right, yields only partial and perspectival insight into the latter, such is our scientific success. Okay, so taking stock, I've suggested the idea that science achieves truth should not be taken to be a requirement for scientific realism. There may be a deep relationship between the objects of scientific understanding and the objects of scientific knowledge that is not a relationship of identity. In particular, perhaps science generates understanding of phenomena by providing knowledge of the laws, patterns, and tendencies they embody. This kind of view requires working out what the objects of scientific knowledge are then, what I call the difference, and then how that qualifies as an epistemic achievement about the targets of investigation, what I call the connection. I've indicated how those components of this form of realism play out for causal pattern realism. Namely, we come to understand phenomena by generating knowledge of the causal patterns that they embody. Okay, so I want to end briefly by suggesting that this way of being a realist is not only possible, but also might even have some advantages. Notice, first of all, that this approach suggests that the question of realism might be reformulated from, does science uncover legitimate knowledge even about unobservables, to about what, if anything, does science uncover legitimate knowledge? What, if anything, should we be realists about on the basis of our scientific findings? I like that reformulation. I think even if I'm wrong about a lot of the particulars, I think that framing of the question is productively interesting versus arguing about whether atoms are real. I guess I have to move to something other than atoms. But anyway, I have proposed causal patterns as a candidate here, in the epistemic sense of claiming that we have scientific knowledge of them, and thus also in the ontic sense of positing the existence of causal patterns. Causal patterns might well not be the only kind of thing we should be realists about on the basis of scientific findings. That isn't a requirement of the view I've outlined. So for example, I think some existence claims about individual events also likely qualify as legitimate scientific knowledge, like life on Earth evolved from one or a few common ancestors, a particular claim about a particular historical event, or adding the starch will turn this iodine solution blue. In some cases, scientific explanations may also provide knowledge of target phenomena themselves. I pointed to idealization and features of scientific modeling as reasons to doubt that, by and large, this is so. Explanations that don't involve models or idealizations may not face these complications. So this version of selective realism is meant to replace a realism predicated on the requirement that scientific accounts aim for or achieve truth about the targets of investigation directly. It's meant to replace realism about the nature of phenomena depicted in science with a realism about some of the causal patterns embodied by those phenomena. This approach to realism has some advantages over a realism that posits target phenomena as the objects of scientific knowledge. To start with, this realism about causal patterns better accommodates some features of our present-day scientific achievements. The motivation for this approach, after all, is accommodating scientific practices bound up with the production of scientific knowledge that don't seem to be in pursuit of truth of target phenomena, or at least not in pursuit of truth of target phenomena alone, as I described in the first part of the talk. Beyond that, this approach predicts a continuing plurality of scientific accounts of the very same phenomena, whenever scientists are interested in different features of those phenomena, rather than a movement toward a single integrated account. I take it that this well describes the present situation in lots of fields of science, as evidenced by the philosophical popularity of all sorts of kinds of pluralism at this point. This approach reconciles this continuing plurality of accounts with both a realist perspective and with the expectation of a unitary empirical reality. I don't have to say anything spooky about reality on this view. Both of which I at least find to be compelling ideas, worth maintaining if possible. Okay, so I wonder also, this is more speculative, I wonder also whether a causal pattern realism might not also open up an interpretation of cumulative scientific progress that resists the anti-realist pessimism. If we are traditional realists, then we must conclude that science has fallen short of knowledge again and again, and that theory change doesn't, by and large, seem to be getting us closer to the truth. Many superseded scientific theories posit radically different views of the world, and thus must have been radically incorrect from the perspective of our current theories. Thus, the pessimistic meta-induction. Why think our current accounts are true when their many predecessors were not? In contrast, if we're causal pattern realists, the outlook might be rosier. Taking our scientific achievements to constitute objective understanding of phenomena based in knowledge of some among many causal patterns enables a subtler accounting of what past scientific achievements have had right. The relationality of knowledge of causal patterns to the cognitive needs of the investigators and their audiences enables a possible explanation for radically different accounts. Though all can't be true, right? That radically different past theories can't be true from the perspective of our current theory. All of these might still achieve or at least pursue knowledge of different causal patterns. Further, the sensitivity of our stores of scientific knowledge to the cognitive circumstances of scientists and their audiences can help legitimize the social influences on past scientific findings that other realisms instead tend to take as threats. Of course, some scientific conjectures are simply wrong. They posit causal patterns that don't exist. But it's plausible to think that past science has latched on to some of the many causal patterns embodied in phenomena of interest, or partially latched onto them, gotten part of the way on a different project. Many previously accepted theories captured causal patterns that are embodied in phenomena, even if they were later replaced by other theories that depicted other patterns, radically different, subtly different, depends, including sometimes more refined relatives of the original pattern. Causal pattern realism provides resources that may enable us to account for theory change, resembling reduction of prior theories to their replacements in terms of related and radical theory change in terms of transforming priorities, questions, and assumptions. Of course, one would need to motivate the plausibility of this approach for specific instances of theory change, which is a project that is, first of all, longer than I have today, and second of all, kind of beyond the strengths of my expertise. So my articulation of how a causal pattern realism can accommodate theory change is going to remain suggestive. Kyle Stanford and Dana Tulodzicki, among others, have argued against selective realism's ability to rebut the pessimistic meta-induction. Both of these authors highlight how superseded theories fare poorly with regards to successful reference and approximate truth from the perspective of our current theories, which are presumed by the realists, right? If you're going to be a realist, these current theories are presumed to be true. But causal pattern realism does better here too. Causal pattern realism does not posit the truth of our current best theories, at least not their truth of the targets of investigation. Because different accounts of the same phenomena may target distinct or even unrelated causal patterns, misconstruing other features of the target phenomena along the way. These accounts emphasize different aspects and even posit potentially different entities. We shouldn't expect that a past theory's successes will be conserved from the perspective of our current theory. But we do have grounds for suspecting that past scientific accounts succeeded at generating scientific knowledge of causal patterns apt for the epistemic and social locations in which they were formulated. There can be different and even incompatible ways to define causal variables that give rise to patterns of counterfactual dependence invariant over some range of conditions. Note, though, that this does leave intact the ability to diagnose shortcomings, empirical and programmatic as well, in past scientific research. Okay, so whatever knowledge science generates is in response to our cognitive needs. That much I think is uncontroversial. And our cognitive needs regularly motivate simplified accounts of our complex world. Simplified accounts privilege some aspects of phenomena to draw connections with other related phenomena while neglecting other aspects. This is one reason for the widespread value of idealizations. In this talk, I've argued that these simplified accounts can qualify as knowledge, even if they are not strictly true of phenomena, insofar as they are knowledge of something else. It has often been said that science focuses on laws, regularities, and repeat phenomena rather than one-off events. It's not a far stretch from that sort of truism that's broadly accepted to suggest that science achieves an understanding of phenomena, the events and occurrences of our world, by generating knowledge of some of the laws, patterns, and tendencies these phenomena embody, that is, of causal patterns. Causal pattern realism enables scientific realism to be maintained regardless of scientists' habit of sacrificing truth of phenomena for other epistemic priorities, and it holds promise for a realism-friendly interpretation of past scientific change and present scientific knowledge. Science is always in revision, but along the way, one might think, it's amassing ever more understanding via knowledge of causal patterns. The end. Thank you. That's a phenomenon. That's like the thing that, putting it into slightly more realistic scientific circumstances, occurrences that scientists encounter, right? That we seek to explain, that scientists and their audience seeks to explain. So in that case, the causal pattern, in certain contexts of explanation, right? When the audience has certain cognitive needs, I said, I think the best explanation for why the pressure roughly doubles when the volume roughly halves is this really broad generality, the ideal gas law, right? The relationship between pressure, volume, number of particles, and temperature. There's everything in there. Okay, so in that case, how they come apart then is, so you said, seems like being more accurate of the causal pattern is going to get you more accurate predictions of phenomena and vice versa. The problem with the vice versa is in this case, I think, with certain cognitive needs, the best explanation we can give is this highly idealized representation of the interrelationship between pressure and volume with certain parameters in the background. Okay, and getting more accurate of the phenomenon, which you can always do by specifying intermolecular attractions and repulsions, intermolecular forces, is actually going to be a net explanatory loss. Right, so that's the kind of key separation, is that there's ways in which you can get less explanatory knowledge in virtue of being more accurate of the phenomenon itself. And so part of this, and this is something I said really early in the talk, and didn't really emphasize beyond that, but in my view, that's because, and this is, I don't think it's that unusual, at least generically formulated. In my view, generality is really explanatorily important to us. We seek these like broad patterns. So if what I care about is the interrelationship between pressure and volume, when you start telling me about intermolecular forces, I'm gonna be like, what are you talking about? That's irrelevant here. I just need this really, I need, first of all, the sense of the interplay between pressure and volume that you can tell me about without referring to all of these details that would actually get us more accurate of the phenomenon. And then also I want to know that this is in fact a really broad regularity, right? Which you can also indicate with the simple formulation of the ideal gas, something like that.
You can follow, but I'm mostly just going to sit here and think. So thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to you. That's the second question.
Okay, I tend to look at these issues from the standpoint of the early modern metaphysicians that I teach in the literature of modern. And there, something like realism would seem to contrast with idealism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the interpretation of scientific theories, the clearest, opponent of realism would seem to be Berkeley. He wants to save the appearances of Newtonian physics, but he doesn't believe in matter. He doesn't even believe in a third dimension of space, and because he's an idealist. Now that seems to be, there's nothing left of realism if you do that.
Yeah.
Now what I worry about here is, why couldn't a metaphysical idealist buy into your version of realism, and there's nothing left but the word. What you really are, see, and I worry about the importance that you attach to causality and causal patterns, because what is causality? I mean, there, in the early modern period, what it mainly meant was some kind of necessary connection. But with some early modern idealists, Berkeley and also Leibniz, the necessity goes away, right? And you seem to be conceding some of that too, because your causal patterns are only roughly, and there was one place where you suggested, well, maybe for the most part, it goes back to a certain kind of causality you find in Aristotle, where these patterns hold always or for the most part, and that's not like modern mechanism. It's not modern science even, and so and one way you could interpret causality, that it's been interpreted, in fact, is a sort of pragmatic way. The cause is what if we do this, then that will happen. And it becomes very instrumentalist and pragmatic. And I don't know, I didn't see anything in your account that would save us from, see, if you want to be a realist, right, you don't want to go that way about causality. You want causes to be, you want them to be part of the mental framework of nature.
Interesting.
and they have to.
The bumping.
Yeah, and if you're going to be a realist, you have to believe that stuff.
Interesting.
And
Okay. Yeah.
my scientific realist colleague, Dick Boyd, was a Marxist, and he was a sort of Marxist-Leninist. And and Lenin's opponent was Mach, right? Who was an instrumentalist. See, and I tend to see these issues set up this way. And you appear to be trying to save the name realism, but your view, you begin to look like Berkeley and Mach and all these enemies of realism. See?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how can you claim to be a realist?
Why is it a realist?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna start with causation and then go back to like realism, idealism. So causation, I don't think, I'm not, okay, sorry. I'll start here. I said very briefly that I'm following Woodward with causation. And I think that there are actually lots of good reasons to do that. I can't motivate that here, but that is an acknowledged part of what I'm doing. And so so following Woodward, I'm thinking about causation as variable dependence, right? And by doing that, I'm already building my way into sort of moving away from token events to types and looking at counterfactual dependence, one particular way of thinking about counterfactual dependence. I think that there actually are good reasons. First of all, I have at least argued that sense of causation, I think, is at least epistemically basic. That's how we get anywhere. I'm increasingly pretty sure that there are reasons to think that that's metaphysically basic too, but that's not what I do. Okay, so the kind of realism that I'm developing here is definitely not going to tell you. It's not going to tell you that it's going to be disappointing if you've set up your target for scientific realism as requiring bumpings among subatomic particles as being what's really real at the basis of everything that we're getting to with science. I don't think we have evidence that that's what science is trying to do. And I kind of got to this a little bit with the ways in which I think this alternative form of realism, I think, accords pretty well with how we do see science playing out. Okay, so that was the causal bit. So I do think philosophically, this is such a bad talk / paper for me to give because I'm so uncomfortable thinking about scientific realism. Like I said, this isn't my sort of forte. It feels to me from the outside, someone who hasn't done a lot of scientific realism, that the question of scientific realism versus empiricism, instrumentalism, sort of whatever opponents put there, is pretty different in kind from the debate between realism and idealism. And I have in mind the former specifically, and I am not going to be very adept at saying how it does or doesn't map onto the latter. But I wanted to use this slide as an anchor point for like, why am I even taking myself to be talking about realism in this talk? So this is a point where I sort of asked for a sort of back off point from defining realism, scientific realism, as the view that our scientific theories are true or increasingly true. And I relied on this kind of generic statement from the SAP that realism is a commitment to the idea that our best scientific theories have a certain epistemic status. So I'm going to say in general, our best scientific accounts have a certain epistemic status. Our best scientific accounts yield knowledge of aspects of our world. So that's what I think is realist, even on this wild kind of view, suspicious kind of realism that I'm developing is, I think science just straightforwardly yields knowledge of our world, right? Not some eventual perfect science, but our knowledge, our science right now. And it has been for a long time, even as we have inconsistencies between past successes in knowledge and current successes in knowledge. So that's why I think this deserves to be a scientific realism, right? So in contrast to instrumentalism or empiricism that wants to say science is successful in all of these tangible ways, but we don't have epistemic warrant to move from that to, you know, a stronger claim of genuine knowledge about how the world really is. Does that help at all? I should never ask, does that help? I should just say curated. I've answered that.
And the other question I had is, you want to talk about knowledge, but you don't want to talk about truth. I think there's a connection between knowledge and truth.
That's this whole project.
What you know is the truth. And if you don't, if it isn't the truth, you don't know it.
I agree. This whole project is a long-winded way of me getting to an answer to that question, which is, you're absolutely right. What I have knowledge of is true. I shouldn't put it that way. What science has generated knowledge of is true. Science has generated knowledge on this view of general patterns, regularities, laws, how things tend to go. It's true. That is absolutely 100% true of those generalities, ceteris paribus laws, patterns. Sorry, I lost my list of nouns. It's not true of the phenomena they explain. And so we do have truth and knowledge tightly connected. People tell me knowledge has to be factive. Fine, I've given you your factive bit, right? Scientific knowledge is true of causal patterns. It's not true of phenomena. And I think this is almost readily apparent, right? So why do we do lab science? Because we have to artificially simplify so much so that we get really close to the phenomena, to what is true of a causal pattern being true of the phenomena in the lab. Not fully true, but like we get really close with like super simple lab science. But in the real world, we're nowhere close to truth of phenomena. But we do have explanation of, pressure roughly doubling when volume roughly halves, because we have genuine knowledge, true knowledge of the pattern depicted in the ideal gas law.
I'll leave it to others.
Follow-up?
So there are weird people who think it's correct to refer to false knowledge, but it seems to me you're not going there. What you're talking about are knowledge that approximates truth, or you're not wanting to claim absolute truth. So approximations, or what is it?
I don't even want to say approximation. And it's because any given phenomena has all of these different causal patterns embodied in my view, right? So we can talk about this particular balloon, the pressure roughly doubling when the volume's roughly halved. I can explain that with reference to the ideal gas law. Or
Are
I
you
could
gonna
explain
give
it.
up? Are you gonna allow false knowledge?
No. Knowledge, scientific knowledge is 100% true of causal patterns. It's not even approximately true of phenomena, not even approximately, which is why we need to do this whole complex longing data here if we're going to be scientific realists, which, like I said, the landing point actually doesn't sound that wacky. Scientific knowledge consists in knowledge of general laws, regularities, and patterns. Like lots of philosophers have said that. It's just, I need to do some wacky things along the way, really getting there.
Is this a follow-up or separate?
I wish I had Dr. Wood's energy to ask a question. So how are the causal patterns in our theory supposed to represent reality if the patterns are one, dependent or mapping some sort of dependency relation, and two, they're making use of idealized either phenomenon or relations, like in the ideal gas law, they use the ideal gas constant. So how are they supposed to, since those patterns make use of an idealization, which is false of reality, how do they relate to reality? Because it seems to me like if the idealizations don't matter, then we end up with your opponent Chris Pincock's view, which is idealizations just point out that these things don't matter in the first place. So how would you separate yourself from this view?
Okay, good, thanks. Causal patterns relate to reality by being part of reality. They just are, they're real. So that's my starting, that's not my full answer, don't worry. That's my starting point. So PV equals nRT, right? Ideal gas law. Sorry, PV equals nRT, ideal gas law, is a representation of a causal pattern. The causal pattern is the interrelationship between pressure, volume, and temperature. Make this more accurate if it needs to be. Sorry, I ran low on blood sugar resources. So interrelationship between pressure, volume, and temperature in a range of systems. A really broad range of systems involving gases in a really broad range of circumstances. The causal pattern depicted in the ideal gas law is real in that all of those systems behave that way. And systems like those in the relevant respects and different in a lot of other respects that occur tomorrow and the next day and forever will do the same. So the causal pattern depicted in the ideal gas law just is real. It's the sort of counterfactual relationships and how these things tend to go. Those are real. Okay, so the idealization bit. So the causal patterns themselves don't involve idealizations because they're not representations. Causal patterns aren't created in scientific studies, right? The causal patterns are the thing, the interrelationships out there in the world between variables. So idealizations are helpful in representing causal patterns by introducing falsehoods of phenomena in order to get a clear depiction of the causal pattern those ranges of phenomena embody. So idealizations like, this gas is composed of non-interacting point particles is important to depicting accurately the ideal gas law because it doesn't hold without that idealization, right? It's essential for that depiction, even as it's made the representation of a gas as ideal, right? Or the representation of PV equals nRT, which relies on positing the gas as ideal, literally false of every single gas in our world. Did I get to the bit that threw you off?
I might just be obstinate, but I'm still failing to see how that, since it requires the idealization, could even represent causal pattern actually in the world, which does not include any idealization.
Okay, so the causal pattern doesn't involve an idealization because idealizations are posits, right? So there may be kind of a sleight of hand there that's confusing. What corresponds in the causal pattern to the idealization, the depiction of the causal pattern for me, how would I say this? So what requires the idealization that a gas is ideal is that in fact the variable of intermolecular of molecule size and intermolecular forces is a real causal influence, and so you don't get don't get the broad causal pattern depicted in PV equals nRT in this interplay of pressure, volume, and temperature, unless you fakely assume that these things don't matter or that these things are absent, right? So you have to say something that's, and this actually is, I didn't get to your question about why what I've gotten here is something Chris Pincock would still disagree with, and this is gives me an opportunity to. A lot of folks who make a big deal about idealization say what we get to idealize are the sort of incidental factors that aren't important causes. I think that's just like patently false when we look at the science. Scientists are regularly idealizing really important causal variables like molecular size and intermolecular pressure in a range of conditions where the specifics of the exponendum enable it, right, in these sort of ad hoc ways.
Gary?
Yeah, thanks. I have many questions, but I'll try to just focus on one. Taking the knowledge point, you think that what we know is true, and we do know somehow through the inaccurate theories or the idealized ones what the causal patterns are. So my thought is, if we know this, then we must be able to say what the causal patterns are without the idealized theories.
Why?
Because there must be some content to what we know, right? And that has to be distinct from the theory because that's the part that we know that's true. So otherwise, is it just, we know something, but I can't tell you what we know. All I can tell you is that it's true.
Okay, so I'm not sure I quite get the problem yet. So I'm going to try to talk about it a bit, and you can tell me what I'm missing.
Well, maybe I'm sorry. Maybe I should be more helpful. What I mean is, what would put in the box of what we know would be the relevant causal pattern, the one that we're focused on as being the object of our interest in some sense, according to your theory, your view. And in the case of the ideal gas law, from what I gather, it would be something like, if I take a balloon and I squeeze it, I have its volume, I double its pressure inside, and ... Many other cases similar to that, something like that. So that's the thing we supposedly know that we explain, but with use of materials that aren't actually true. The ideal gas law posits it isn't correct, right? So what is it that we know, and can't we just say what that is without the ideal gas law?
So let me see if this helps. So what we know is the interrelationship among pressure, temperature, and volume in an astonishingly broad range of systems. That's what we know. It's that regularity, right? And that shows up in this like specific, squeezing the balloon and the pressure doubling, as well as like really unrelated stuff, right? That follows this interrelationship between pressure, volume, and temperature. So that's the content. We can't depict, I've just said it, I guess, without idealizing. We can't depict it mathematically or pretend as if it's a straightforward relationship that's exceptionalist without idealizing, because it's not, right? Because every time, in every single system, when we apply it, we're lying a little bit. We're assuming that there's that the molecules of gas are literally points, right? Which none are, and that there are literally no intermolecular forces, which I think there never are. Is never true. I think it's just that they get really small, right? Very, very. You get small particles, and you can get very weak intermolecular interactions. So we have to say something literally false to ignore those parts of every single system we look at that we don't care about, to focus in on this general pattern that's really real, the general pattern in how pressure, temperature, and volume interrelate. And that's like really important scientific knowledge. It's an achievement to see that general pattern.
One small follow-up, are you suggesting that we can know it's true, but we can't say what it is that we know without the ideal gas law?
So what we know is what's depicted in the ideal gas law. It's not true
Why
of
can't we
any
just-
system.
I mean, if we know the gas law is a distortion, and we know, on your view, something true about what it's depicting, why can't we just say what that is?
But we do. But this is why I think this is why I don't think we should discount the epistemic importance of idealizations, because this might not be the only way to depict causal patterns that phenomena deviate from, sometimes or always, but it's like a really important scientific tool to do so, is to say, suppose your gas is composed of point particles, suppose that don't interact, suppose the population is infinite in size, suppose humans are perfectly rational. Like, nobody thinks these things are true, but it's a really useful way of setting up the rules such that the relationship of interdependence of certain variables, certain features of systems we care about are strictly hold, when in reality they only kind of do that. Does that help?
A little, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
I shouldn't have said when in reality, when in actual phenomena, they're making a big deal about alcohol patterns.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sarah?
Thank you so much for your talk. So I understand this, right, you're trying to detach realism from theoretism, I think, and you make what, and I thought the next step would be theoretism about what, because it seems like the realism is about the causal patterns, and so the theoretism is also
Yep.
about the causal
Yeah,
patterns.
we can say that.
But it seems like you need to say that, like it seems like the connection remains true, right? Like the knowledge is generated from us saying that the causal patterns are real, like having some knowledge about that. So it's like we still have to say that at least something
Of causal patterns.
Causal patterns.
Absolutely. Yes, yes,
And
yes, and
so-
yes, agreed completely.
And so I don't feel like we're actually detaching.
So I have another paper that no one will publish. So it's now just on Phil Sci Archive, and I'm giving up, but it's there, called Why It Matters That Idealizations Are False. And so there I argue. Okay, so I agree with everything you've said, but I'm going to say a couple of things different, and I'll say why my other paper is relevant. Yes, I think that if I'm saying causal patterns are real, right? That's the ontic move. And if I'm going to be a realist about them in the epistemic sense of saying we have knowledge about them, right? Then I would be a veritist of what our scientific accounts tell us about causal patterns. Okay. This isn't my understanding. I don't think Chris Pincock would be happy with that. This isn't my understanding of what the veritists about scientific explanation hold. They think any explanations have to be true of what is explained. What is explained is the messy reality. It's the phenomena that we encounter in the lab, in the field, etc. And on the view that I've constructed, we can't be veritists about our explanations of those, right? Our explanations are not true or approximately true or aiming to be true of the messy phenomenon. They're aiming to be true of a causal, one among lots of causal patterns embodied by those phenomena. Right, so back to the gas law, just one thing we could say about this gas. Any gas is part of a system that has other features. We could say things that have no relationship to the ideal gas law if we had other interests in that system. So that seems like a pretty big difference to me. So in this other paper, because people like, and this isn't meant to be dismissive of the question at all, it's a great question, great thing to push me on. People love pushing me on that. They're like, aha, you believe in truth after all, I told you. But let's not, like, so in this Why It Matters That Idealizations Are False paper, I want to say that we lose so much if we say, aha, turns out these idealized accounts we have from science are literally true. You know, game over, we're done here. because there's so much that is obscured in the distance between the causal patterns and the actual phenomena. And losing that kind of puts us back in the same confusing muddle we were in before, where we can't see, for example, how we can have lots of different accounts of the very same phenomenon and how those each could be, could each constitute scientific knowledge, even as they posit different things about the phenomenon.
Yeah, it's like, I guess it's like they only constitute scientific knowledge, like, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not knowledge of the phenomenon. Yeah, we have knowledge of causal patterns, and that knowledge of causal patterns non-factively explains the phenomenon. And so that's where I think you need the gap.
The chapter of already talks about scientific theories, and you shifted to talking about scientific explanations. And I was a little bit puzzled about that shift. No, the theory doesn't say that the ideal gas law is true. It says that, well, the particles do have some to interact, and we actually have more accurate functional laws connecting volume. So far that doesn't look like it's a knock against the theory at all. Idealizations play a lot of roles in science, often because practical, very difficult, and you just need a result with a certain degree of accuracy, and the theory explains why you get it with that degree of accuracy. Right? So there's sort of pragmatic factors that work there. So maybe you think there are equally good objections just to the theories themselves. I'm also wondering about the approximately true bit, because even when you say what knowledge we get, the causal patterns that you identify are ones which you want to say, well, they're only sort of roughly right, because you're using the ideal gas law, for example, to identify the causal pattern, and that's only roughly right. It breaks down the high pressures. So if you're using the roughly or approximately true move for your realism, why can't the scientific realists who want to focus on the content of theories use the same move?
Yeah, okay. Thanks. That's a helpful question. Okay, so two things I want to say in response. It's a helpful thing to push me on. First of all, so you're absolutely right, I made the slide from realists talk about theories. I'm going to talk about models, laws, scientific accounts becomes my generic terms, the sort of things that explain. The reason I make that move is that I think one thing I can say about that move and why it's fair is, and it's a reframing from what I've said here, I think a lot of our scientific knowledge does not comprise theories, right? It was not contained in our theories. Scientific theories can be where we find our scientific knowledge, but there's lots of other ways of developing scientific accounts, right? Scientific modeling that isn't sort of directly in service to a well-developed theory, and other things besides. I don't know, that's the main one I can come up with. Okay, so that's why I make this sort of shift to a generic scientific accounts. And I think you're right that I mean, there's a reason I started by going on about models. There's a way in which focusing elsewhere away from theories sort of gets us into places where it's easier to see how scientific accounts might not be literally true. Right? Whereas when our scientific account is a theory, it starts to, start to be in the territory of being more truth conservative, right? The rules are slightly different in how that's a bit of scientific work plays out. Okay, and I did, by the way, another thing I'll say in passing before getting to my second point that I think responds to your challenge is that I did try to leave some room at the end of my talk and say, okay, if a scientific account doesn't rely on idealizations and makes truth claims, right, that in fact are true phenomena, then you won't have this distance, right? You can be scientific realists about phenomena themselves. So for the sort of picture that I'm developing to be right, it doesn't need to be right of every scientific account. But I think idealizations are used so broadly in science that whenever we're playing that, whenever our scientists are playing that game, we're going to be in this territory, I think. Okay, I'm trying to remember the second thing I was going to say and how it related to your challenge. So, okay, so first of all, I think models models can generate scientific knowledge for us operating in the absence of well-developed theory. So that's one reason to generalize. I think that more broadly, whenever we have idealizations, like I said, we're going to have to, I think, I think as I've tried to motivate in this talk. Gosh, I can't remember why. What else? What happened? There was something else I was going to answer that you asked.
So the causal patterns we get to identify are not really strictly true because it's based on the gas law. True. So we have to say, well, it's not that it's true. I'm not that kind of scientific realist. Knowledge of it's approximately true. So what we know is it's approximately true.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So why can't
Yeah. Why isn't that enough? Thank you.
Gas law is approximately true.
Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to say. Okay, here is why I think we can't just say the ideal that gas law is approximately true, or I guess stepping a step away from that formulation. Here's why I think it's worth giving up on approximate truth as the goal for our explanations, or scientific accounts, right? Having made that move to a more general formulation in theories. But I think this is the case for theories on a regular basis as well, even if not all theories. I do think our approximate truth isn't really at stake with the first one. I think our explanations are regularly judged to be successful, even as they are not entirely true. All right, fine, approximate truth works for that. I think that regularly explanations are deemed to be better explanations that are less true than alternatives that are available right then, right? So in some range of circumstances, I think the ideal gas law is a better explanation than van der Waals equation worked through with the parameters of the system. And it has to do with the ability to depict general patterns, right? So if what is explanatory to me in my cognitive circumstances is this really rough relationship, pretty universal relationship between pressure and volume, then if I start talking about if I start saying artificially simple or artificially specific things about particle size and intermolecular attraction, I've lost that pattern entirely. And I'm saying something much more specific at that point. So I've lost generality for accuracy. And so that's why one reason why I think approximate truth can't work is that we regularly see the willful sacrifice of more approximately true for other values of our accounts, scientific accounts.
Did you have a very brief follow-up?
We have time.
Yes, if we can make it quick.
So, please, maybe this will help, consider like the completely true theories, which say, the behavior of the balloon, the counterfactual behavior of the balloon is within such and such bounds of what's predicted by the ideal gas law, and it's in so narrow bounds, what's predicted by such more specific. That kind of, how does your view differ from and improve on the kind of veritism which says, science aims to get at truths, specifically interesting truths, and one kind of flavor of very interesting and useful truth is, the truth that relates balloon and its counterfactual behavior to a simple description.
I didn't understand the question. Sorry, I understood what you set up, but what is the question?
So how does your improve on or maybe this is actually just a verbal dispute, which would also the verbal difference would also be super interesting. This sort of bland veritism, which says learning facts about idealizations are often really illuminating. But it's not because we
seeking to have true theories that take the form of a relation, of pointing out a relationship between the counterfactual facts about a balloon and like some kind of mathematical, precise mathematical description. It's the pressure varies within whatever epsilon of the value given by the ideal gas law.
So I want to emphasize the extent to which that is the game, the generating knowledge of broad patterns, and how to play that game, our scientists liberally make even unforced false posits, not claims, posits about the stuff that they're investigating.
If I was such a, the thought was that maybe you wouldn't have to have any false posits. It would be literally true that the change in temperature and pressure would be within such and such distance of the change in pressure predicted by.
So it's literally true. There's some sort of softened claim that is literally true.
Exactly. This is going
So
on.
how is this? How does this have content beyond that? So so one thing I think you can say is there's difficulties with, in general, making that strategy work that probably mirror the difficulties with replacing ceteris paribus clauses, right? So it's muddy in how it plays out. And this is something I didn't say earlier, but I see why this relates to the question I was just answering is when I talk about the idea of gas law, one thing that's inconvenient for me about that example is the physics is really well understood. So you all can say, aha, but what about this really general account with all the parameters, which even if I can't fill in the parameters, I can tell you they're there. So much science where idealizations are made and where I think we have genuine full-fledged knowledge of patterns, we can't do that, right? Yeah, anyway, I would try to give an example, but I think it'll take me too long.
Okay, we have about 7 more questions in just over 15 minutes. So if we can keep them, let's keep them as full as we possibly can on this 15 minutes. I'm going to prioritize people who aren't coming to the dinner as well. So, so Adam, you're next.
Okay, thank you. I want to know what you mean by the word embody, or alternatively, how you understand the relation of embodying. And the reason I'm interested in that is that the crucial contrast you're drawing is you're saying that science aims at and provides knowledge of causal patterns. It doesn't aim at or provide knowledge of the phenomena. But you said that the phenomena embody causal patterns. So I want to know, first of all, why it is that in knowing something about causal patterns, we don't thereby know some truths about the phenomena. And secondly, I want to know why it is that if I know that the phenomena embodies the causal pattern, I don't thereby know something true about the phenomena.
Wait, say that, say that second.
If I know that the phenomena embody the causal pattern, why don't I thereby know truths about the phenomena?
You do.
And why is it doubtful? But I thought you were saying that the science.
It's still not the case that it's still not the case that PV equals nRT is true. But yeah, you can say, here is a true claim about the phenomenon. This gas roughly embodies the relationship PV equals nRT. And I forget what was the one before that on true
Why is
claims.
it that in knowing the causal patterns, why don't I thereby know something about the phenomena?
I think
Given
you
that
do.
the phenomena embody the causal pattern.
Yes.
That's why I was asking, what do you mean by embodying?
And so you also know a true claim. Okay, I'm going to work backwards. So you know the true claim that that this gas roughly embodies PV, the causal pattern PV equals nRT. Yes. You do not know that do not know of this gas that PV equals nRT for this gas, because it is literally not true that in this gas PV equals nRT. You have to start saying things about approximately, et cetera. Okay. So there is a variable length disconnect between a true depiction of a causal pattern and approximate truth of a phenomenon, where sometimes a literally true depiction of a causal pattern gets pretty close, starts to approximate truth of the phenomenon. And then there are other cases where something, a literally true depiction of a causal pattern is not even approximately true of a phenomenon, but can still explain the phenomenon. So you have this variability. Okay, so embodiment, what does it mean for, I'm being so disappointed in this. what does it mean for a phenomenon to embody a causal pattern? It means that it corresponds to the regularities that are depicted in the depiction of the causal pattern. What it means, sort of like, metaphysically, I don't know. I don't know how to do that part. But I don't think you need anything particularly fancy. It's something about the sort of counterfactual behavior of systems that embody the pattern, that they tend to do. They tend to obey certain relationships depicted in characterizations of causal patterns. Looks like that didn't help. I'm trying to be briefer though. So
But again, it just, it leaves me still wondering why it is. that
okay,
the
good.
view
So
is-
this is some.
Is not giving us truths about the phenomena.
Let me say one other thing.
That was the selling point. It's
So-
science not aiming at or providing truths about phenomena.
Okay, so there are true things we can say about phenomena, okay? But those aren't the things that scientists are saying about them. Scientists are saying, hey, look, PV equals nRT. Hey, look, this ecological pressure led to this creature having a trait. Those are not true claims. There are true claims you can have that are mediated by the causal pattern. Right? This phenomenon roughly corresponds to this broader causal pattern. Scientists don't say those things. They just say, I think mostly, they just say, hey, look, that ecological pressure led to this creature having this trait, etc., in ways that are sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly scaffolded with a bunch of simplifications and inaccuracies of other features of the phenomenon.
So I can't, somebody just abusing my power to the chat.
Just rip up the list. Right?
No. But can you just say a tiny bit more, like what it's, so I also shared Adam's concern. Is it that, what exactly is going on? Is it that it doesn't apply to the phenomena straightforwardly because other variables that exist with respect to the phenomena are somehow interfering?
Yeah,
with the actual,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why so we're saying, like, in this particular respect, this would be true. We can't directly predicate it as a phenomenon because so many other things are sort of true. It's going to complicate the story of it.
Yeah. And so in the new example, not even example, characterization of where an example would be that I just gave, we can talk about the causal role of selection bringing about a trait when selection has a causal role.
Yeah.
But you're going to do that, your actual model, right, is going to assume the population is infinite size and set various other convenient parameters so that you can ignore a whole bunch of other causal influences.
Yeah, okay.
And so you're going to have to say that false stuff to figure out what the true stuff you want to say is. And because of that, you're going to have a very limited slice of knowledge about this trait of our creature that I'm not specifying, that is only one part of the story. But then because you're an evolutionary ecologist, you're going to say, okay, we're done here. I've explained the trait. Okay, sorry.
My lips are sealed. It's your fault for giving such an interesting talk. Yeah. So we're going to go online for our next question.
Okay, we have two. Is that okay?
Okay, if
All right.
you want to give both. Maybe,
I'll just read. Yes, I'll read them to you if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, the first one is from Andrew Smith, one of our grad students. Here's what he says. I'm losing track of in what sense the patterns are separate from phenomena in response to Gary's question. It sounds like the pattern we know is a big conjunction of counterfactual, for the most part, regularities in a variety of systems. Conjunctions of the form such as, quote, for the most part, were you to increase pressure of these things, then ... end quote. But each of these conjuncts is about phenomena, right? Or why not? Parents, sorry if this overlaps the first question. I didn't hear it because I was muted.
Okay, yes. Yeah, so causal patterns, the reality of causal patterns should be really closely related to phenomena. Otherwise, it starts to get really funky and spooky if I say, oh, the causal patterns are the real things. Look over there, not in our world. But it can be exhausted by a major conjunction about all these different systems of gases that I know about because of the counterfactual content, right? Because it's also telling me what to expect in these other circumstances that I've never even thought of yet, but that can physically occur. And so the reality of the causal pattern is giving us this deep counterfactual knowledge, deep causal knowledge about how things in our world, the phenomena tend to behave, that goes beyond anything I can list out of specific phenomena. So I guess another thing to say there is ideal gas law doesn't work very well for this one either, but there is causal pattern knowledge that of regularities, of patterns that have exceptions, and that the exceptions aren't well understood, right? So it also extends beyond the content of what we can say about specific systems, insofar as if scientists can't predict when we'd have an exception, right? So then we can't say, is this going to be one of those weird cases that we don't know why it's weird, because we don't understand the sort of causal background for these causal patterns.
Andrew adds that his question might have been scooped by Adam a little bit, for what it's worth.
We can do the second question on the
Okay, great. All right, our second question is from David Sussman. He writes, a comparison and then a question. People like Maimonides? Okay. Any ancients? Okay. People like that guy think that we can only grasp God through analogies and metaphors that are necessarily false to some degree. On your view, would that mean that such, quote, negative theology is not really trying to get at the truth about God? Or are the cases not parallel?
such a flat-footed question.
So I mean, I have no idea. I hope you know for the fact that you all are now laughing. But I think here's one thing we could say. So if we hold negative theologists, if we hold that our analogies and metaphors are necessarily false, but they're always better to the extent that they approximate truth, then I think we are in a different situation. So I do think it's very important that in science specifically, very important to what I'm talking about. In science specifically, scientists regularly choose to say less true things of the systems in front of them because they're after something different. So I think that would, I take it, be a difference in the cases.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So the way I view there's a really important difference between knowledge and understanding. And you're saying, we know causal patterns, but we merely understand phenomena.
Exactly.
And I was just curious. I just would like to understand better what you mean by understanding, and in particular. So how does understanding relate to truth?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I try to explain to myself what understanding is, I thought, well, understanding something means to know the answer to a why question, but now understanding seems to collapse into knowledge. So yeah, I'm just curious what you think about understanding and how it relates to truth.
Something I want to bring up. Okay. Okay. So I agree with how you characterize what my view is completely. What is understanding then? You understand a phenomenon when you depict a causal pattern that is embodied by the phenomenon, right? So the causal claims actually made in this depiction are roughly true. The explanandum, right? So roughly like the specification of what it is that we aim to understand about the system is accounted for by what we've said about the system, right? So there has to be, the causal pattern has to actually be embodied. The causal stuff that we're actually saying has to be approximately true. And then that causal stuff has to relate in the right way to the specification of the system that is what we seek to understand. And then beyond that, the explanatory conditions have to be right, where those seeking to understand have to have the right questions, the right background knowledge that this depiction of the causal pattern that we put in front of them, or that they uncover, that they come upon, responds to their questions, right? So that it fills in what they were looking for, and they have the right sort of background knowledge for it to do so. That's the view of like explanation and understanding that's involved in all of this.
So understanding is a lot like having a picture of something.
So understanding of a phenomenon, in my view, is provided by depicting one among many causal patterns embodied in the phenomenon. It can be depicted in lots of different ways that matches the explanatory request in the right ways. And it's not going to be true of the phenomenon. It's not going to be improved by being approximately true of the phenomenon, etc.
We have time for one last question, which would be Ray's question.
You talked about having to open up a gap in some, but not all cases. And am I right in thinking that that gap is gonna decrease the more we understand the phenomenon? So you said the gap is narrower in the case of the gases because we really understand all the things that are going on, and presumably there are fields where we are more or less at a loss, and there the gap is going to be larger.
Yeah, so I think something like your characterization, I think is probably right. I don't think the difference is that we understand more about physical systems than biological systems. I think, I don't have a good answer to this. I think that for some reason, the rules for when you're allowed to idealize if you're a physicist are different from the rules for when you're allowed to idealize when you're a biologist. And I don't think that's a difference in the complexity of the systems, because physical systems are really complex. That's why they like labs. So yeah, I don't know if that's not a compelling answer. I don't know the answer, but I do think that they're, okay, so sorry. Here's another thing I want to say. I don't think that in this circumstance we're imagining where we can give the physical theory that undergirds the ideal gas law, I don't think that in that case we more fully understand some complex physical system out there than in an analogous case for a biological system where we have a different type of scientific knowledge about it. I think in both cases, those are highly partial. What we have in the case of the physics example is a fuller, well worked out set of conditions for one particular aspect of complex and artificially simplified.
So it's not completeness.
Not completeness of understanding of the phenomenon. No, not at all, right? Because, and this is very like early Cartwright, like how the laws of physics lie, Cartwright, I think. If we actually look at the real stuff in our world, right, there's so much that we're leaving out, even if we are talking about these properties of the gases, in zeroing in on just that feature of the system. What we're leaving out still is in causal interplay with, I don't know. So again, the blood sugar, I'm starting to say things I'm less sure I'm saying them the right way. And something like that.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking the speakers.